each, each of the three cities, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, have their own particular characteristics that almost anybody who goes to those cities would immediately notice. If we study from the bottom up, it would be obvious that what we would want to acknowledge are the differences. But what are the differences? Well, ask a sociologist and you get one answer. This is the other part of the prism, is the disciplinary bias that people bring. If we're looking for generalizations about these cities, that is, somebody asks, well, how are they different and how are they similar? A sociologist will tend to look at social relations, just like the original Chicago school, perhaps on neighborhoods, on the spatial sorting of social groups, of racial conflict, of residential patterns. And indeed, those are the elements you find in the original Chicago school because they were sociologists. Ask a political scientist to explain the differences among cities. And here we're not at theory yet. We're at the bottom up. Just sort of what would you notice? What a political scientist will probably notice is our institutional differences. So a political scientist would immediately break out with some kind of soliloquy about, well, Chicago has 50 wards, has had a tradition of centralized government, that Los Angeles is politically fragmented and has been for more than 100 years, that New York is a polyglot of many groups, and that the boroughs in New York each have a strong voice in its governance, and for a long time, therefore, have mediated the relationships among those groups. Well, then we're going to turn to an economist. How do you explain the differences among these cities?
Set up an interview for Friday.
And without reference again to theory, we're not at theory yet. We're just at the disciplinary bias of the observers, the political scientists, or I mean the observers, the economists in this case. Oh, no, we should look at the metropolis as a geography of economies. How central are economic institutions located? Where are businesses located? What are the transportation patterns that connect economic nodes? What's the structural basis of the economy? For example, is it manufacturing? Is it services and so on? So here we have I have encapsulated sort of the early stages of our conversations in Chicago, going back 2 decades, we've gathered together people from different disciplines, and naturally, we all are tending to bring our disciplinary biases to the table as mediating forces, strong mediating forces, determining how we're going to study Chicago. The emergence of theory comes out of a conversation in which people need to generalize. As soon as someone has asked, well, how would you describe Chicago? What are its central features? Again, I go back to disciplinary bias, but if we say, no, I don't want an economic perspective, I don't want political science perspective, I don't want sociology perspective, I want this perspective about the city itself. As soon as we begin to generalize, we go, okay, what will we focus on? We can either go back to a babel of tongues that's fractured into the different disciplines, or we can begin the conversation in which we reach some kind of a notion of how our fields of expertise, how our disciplinary training intersects. That is to say, the object of study is the city. And so to describe the city, we must begin to ask ourselves, what are its characteristics that we can agree on, that we see? The first Chicago school in the 1920s asked themselves, what about Chicago do we see that stands out the most? It was a city built upon neighborhoods. It was a city that was extremely fragmented and separated among neighborhoods, often which were in contention with another. Sometimes there was violent conflict among the neighborhoods. And then they worked themselves to the view that, and this isn't just the neighborhood, but the metropolis has a map. There's a form, and that the further out you get, different things occur. The neighborhoods begin to give way to other zones of residential zones that look quite a bit different than at the center, or to economic activities that look different than at the center. And so they spent their years trying to figure out the spatial configuration of Chicago and the social makeup of the city. Even if you only look at one place, therefore you need a point of departure. What do you want to know? How does the system operate? Do we focus on the spatial form? How do people move around and interact with one another? What's the nature of the economy? What do the institutions look like? In this class and in this context, this interdisciplinary context, we're interested in all of those. So I want to pause and ask you, if you bring to the table a disciplinary bias that you want to acknowledge, or that leads you to assert yourself into the question of how I study the city, that will be your voice as a starting point for a conversation in the first part of the class today.
So simply unmute yourself and answer Dennis's question. What disciplinary bias or point of view do you bring to the study of the city? And we all have it, so you're not going to be graded down for having a point of view.
Even before reading the book, I always thought of city as inner city poor, and as you go out, you get wealthier. And those who go out into the suburbs are people who have cars and are wealthy enough to just go back and forth every day. And that's the bias I brought. Apparently, that's kind of like old Chicago school of concentric circle with the.
Where did you get your bias? Where did you get that original bias?
It's kind of like in my experience in back in my country in South Korea, people who can't afford cars just concentrate in the city, and people who can afford cars and expensive gas, they go outside the city. And that's how I thought about it. And I I heard somewhere that if you can, you don't want to live inside the city because it's really like it's only a place to work. It's not a place to live. And if you want to live, you want to go just a bit further, somewhere to work and somewhere to live. And that's the mindset I
Okay, so if I'm the professor of the class and I ask you to write your first paper, I don't tell you what the topic will be, except that I want you to tell me about the city. Can you tell me in 2 or 3 or 4 sentences, therefore, what are you going to look at? That relates to what you just said. Your bias, your beginning bias.
I'm going to look into the urban sprawl.
So you're going to study urban sprawl.
And the relationship between urban poverty and race. I just thought of it.
So you're probably situated in some notion as the original Chicago school, but brought up to modern context. Sounds like. Anybody else?
Sean has his hand up. Sean?
Yes, thank you, Professor. Jumping in, I guess my own bias, I've lived in Chicago all my life. I've always been a South Sider, lived in various parts of the South Side. So growing up, the perspective somewhat similar to what my classmate was just saying, the understanding living here, and particularly, living in predominantly African-American communities, were that rich people basically moved to the suburbs. If you had money and your family was well-to-do, you moved to the suburbs, and otherwise you lived in the city. Now, understanding that, I also understood there were, so to say, nice parts of the city or richer parts of the city where people live. A long standing, obviously, Lincoln Park comes to mind. It's been a long standing community. That's been a, fairly, nice community. And Hyde Park has traditionally been a nice community. It wasn't until a few years back, I was taking a class at the University of Chicago, and there was we read a book about an ethnographic study a guy did on Skid Row, where the concept of like poor people really living close to downtown registered to me. And I was like, oh my God, like I never thought of it like that until I read that book. And so it kind of gave me a different perspective. So when I saw the rings and everything else from the reading and how things kind of ripple out, it resonated with me of what I read in the book. But back to your question more immediately, my bias would be, the whole, I don't want to just say white flight because it was beyond whites, but anyone that had money that could move to the suburbs and live there as opposed to living in the city, that was kind of, I guess, part of the bias that I grew up with here in Chicago.
So I could put you down for your first paper, you're going to write about white flight. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, I want to interject here. We've only had 2 students speak up, but already I'm thinking, I wonder if there's a way to challenge these views right away. And I think of Rodrigo Salcedo's chapter in the book, in which in Chile, he says, Chilean cities, I'll address the first paper. It's a very automobile dependent city, as well as it has a well-developed transportation city, but it has both. I can assure you Santiago has horrific rush hours. So not everybody uses the subway. And yet, he says, it isn't a city that you could characterize as with extreme racial segregation or social class segregation. It's that populations live in proximity to one another, sprinkled throughout the metropolitan area. So what are we going to do with that idea now? Perhaps the first thing we go is maybe the generalization from an American city won't hold. Or perhaps maybe the generalization from one American city won't necessarily hold for all. Is that where Rodrigo's chapter would take us?
Probably, but that was also the point I wanted to mention,
Yes.
that coming from like the US by many standards is an anomaly in many
Ah,
ways. And in many, and when we focus too much on just American politics, and urban politics is often viewed as like a sub-discipline of American politics, although I personally disagree. I would bring in a perspective where in my country, people, and in the city where I come from, rich people live
And which
downtown.
country and which city? So we know where
It's
you're talking
Moscow,
about.
Russia, but it's true for many other European cities. Rich people live downtown, and in a couple other neighborhoods that are not exactly downtown, but like everyone knows what they are, but they live in the city, and the city is where everything is expensive, and the suburbs are like, you're a loser if you're in the suburbs.
As is true in France.
It's not
and
exactly true in France,
not
but
as
it's
much.
very, it depends. France is a mixed case, I would say. And in
But
Chile,
it's-
the higher up the mountains you live, the richer you are. And they joke
Yes.
that people are moving upper the mountains. So everyone is waiting until they fall off on the other side to Argentina.
Well, that's a refreshing perspective that you bring, because it makes me immediately think of Rodrigo Salcedo and I co-sponsored a conference in Santiago. And we examined the question of whether the American models, theories, applied to Latin America. And voila, we found that they did not. Now, if we had been in the context that you're describing, we would, I suspect, have found something similar. And so you go, okay, we have this entire book written by these scholars, in which they make reference to an LA, a New York, and a Chicago schools. And perhaps you would say, oh, they're all wrong, that they are culturally defined, they're narrow, they're based upon a blinkered view of how the rest of the world operates. Some people might even go further and say, oh yeah, that's what those Americans do. They think everything revolves around them, and so their theories don't have to describe anyone else. Your response? Hello?
Elena, you're muted.
Oh, my response. Okay. I thought it was for the whole class. My response would be comparative urban politics,
Okay.
which I intend to study, and I think it will do everyone a lot of good.
Good. Anyone else?
I'd argue that maybe this view is a little bit too pessimistic. We don't need to throw every single American urban politics book into the trash can when we're analyzing other countries. But maybe we're generalizing the wrong things, right? Like, it might not be about where the rich people live, but it might be about neighborhoods and how we classify and study them. Maybe it's about the political institutions that are in place. I mean, the political machine and clientelism in Latin America are fairly similar. And so I think it's not really about how a particular city developed, but the ways that they're defined. Maybe it might be about reading the causal mechanisms there instead of the actual output.
And so you would have a inductive methodology from the bottom up?
Maybe, but I don't think it's about necessarily being inductive. I think it might be more about, say, regardless of the dynamic between rich and poor, it's looking at a city and saying, okay, there's a spatial component, there's some sort of sorting effect. Maybe there are political coalitions behind it. Taking a look at those things, I feel like it's pretty universal, regardless if the rich live in the center or in the suburbs.
Mhm. Okay, that's the comparative view that's useful. We're going to look for common patterns right away. Anyone else? If you don't speak up, then I'll go into my next presentation. You may not want that yet, so speak up.
Well, I could say that it could be a very interesting comparative case, case
Uh-huh.
study to see where rich people choose to live and
Mhm. Mhm.
what influences that, like why they live in the suburbs in the US mostly, and then some other neighborhood becomes trendy and they move back in, or why they live up in the mountains in Santiago, and et cetera, et cetera.
And that's one refreshing perspective that Rodrigo Saucedo and his colleagues bring to the table, isn't it? A reminder.
If I can just add one more thing, I would assume part of it has to do with generations, and I guess generational changes between obviously parents and children. Part of I guess kind of what we hit on with the American thing is people of better means moving out to the suburbs. But what the cycle that seems to happen, or more so probably is happening more today, is like the parents may get, a couple may get together, move out to the suburbs, better schools, more land, more bang for their buck, better property taxes, things of that nature. And then what happens, they live their life, the children grow up. Now the children have been out in the suburbs the whole time and they're bored. So where's all the action? Back in the city. All the movies, all the concerts, all the theaters, all their friends, all hanging out. Even some of the schools that they want to go to are in the city. So they find themselves moving, to an Andersonville or uptown or something to that degree. And so it's like the cycle repeats. So they're young, or Wicker Park. They're young, kind of college educated young people that are young professionals starting their career. So they're living in the city again before the cycle repeats and they get married and relocate to the suburbs. But I think that plays probably a bigger part nowadays with millennials moving more into the city, which is, we talk about gentrification, we talk about, the different things that are happening in like a Brooklyn or Harlem or some of these other places where you're seeing an influx of maybe even young white people, moving into those neighborhoods, and they can afford them. They're, upward mobile, and you see these things happening and the areas changing. I think, to wrap up my point, I just feel like part of that plays it's a generational thing. As the parents moved one way, as they got older and had families, now as young people, it's reversing. The tide is reversing. So I just wanted to add that.
And Scott Greer, you want to unmute? You made a comment in the chat, but it's probably easier if you actually speak it.
Well, I just want to observe that at least some of the settlement pattern would have had to do with transportation, because obviously you would have had to live close to your workplace within walking, reasonable walking or riding distance. And then as other options came up, be it rail or autos, then those who could afford it would move farther out. But that technology would not necessarily have been available, universally among cities and nations. I mean, like I think autos would have been much more prevalent here in the U.S. and maybe even in the Midwest or in the larger cities than they would have been elsewhere, and it would have applied even more to other cities outside of the U.S.
And
Yes,
Scott, is your background in planning?
Yes, it is, and transportation.
So Dennis had asked the original question, what kind of bias does someone who's interested in planning and transportation bring to the study of the city?
Boy, very tough call.
Must be a good question.
Not sure how to answer that really. I don't know if this really is a suitable response, but one thing that I have observed being a Chicagoan, more or less a lifelong Chicagoan, is that its development pattern was unique in some regards, and you will see that appear on a transportation level when looking at other cities. Like one thing I learned about, I believe it was Kansas City, and why their transportation system faded as early as it is streetcar system, was that was all built in one direction, but the city over time developed more or less in the opposite direction from it.
Well, what I pull out of your contribution is that I left out historians, and that the study of the city probably could not possibly make any sense without a methodology and a sense for recognizing that over time, the possibilities for urban development, spatial development, political development, economic development, and so on, are all constrained by technology, by pre-existing urban form, even by the landscape. Whether a city can spread out across a flat plain, like Oklahoma City, or whether it's closely bounded by geographic circumstance, all of these can have an effect, and historians are keen to recognize how those change over time, or how, and here's a crucial point, how human beings find ways to overcome or get around these restrictions and circumstances.
Steve, while we're on that point, maybe you could talk about the biases that historians bring to the study of the city.
Yeah, very briefly, I'll pick up Dennis's very good point. And as a social historian, schooled in the period of time that I was came into graduate school, I look at social conflict. So I build from those things that Dennis has just mentioned, which is a heavy reliance on historical geography. Many historians start with exactly what Dennis pointed out, the land and how that land was contoured. And as an environmental historian, that's where I almost always go first. So I'm taking a look at how human beings contour what sometimes is called first nature into second nature. And then how that is a reflection also of social relationships and power, political power. And from historians, we actually, because we so broadly deal with everything that's happened in the past, we too are divided into subfields. So you can have a social historian talk about the big issue we've been talking here about spatial change and where people live from a social historian's perspective, or a geography, historical geography perspective, or even a political historian. So we bring in, obviously the bias that we're bringing into is looking over change over time. And then by our subfield. So for me as a social historian, like I said, I look at conflict, and I broadly define conflict to come from environmental change. And then also I like to link it to political change and to policy. But that's my perspective as an environmental historian, because for me, I always like to think about the contemporary manifestations and the role that government plays in mediating those conflicts. But some historians do much more than that, did very different things. That's a great conversation. I really like this.
So we have had a little conversation here about our how different the emergence of specialized scholarship has potentially fractured any ability to reach generalizations or agreement, and that the trick is to create a communication across the disciplines. And that is the emergence in the 20th century of an overarching urban theory. That is to say, what drove the conversation to the middle, that people of different perspectives could begin to talk to one another is that the object of their study, the city, is itself provides a compelling narrative. That every place seems to offer a unique and compelling narrative. My friend Tony Oram, sociologist, a noted sociologist, he also is emeritus from UIC, has written about a closely textured, a thick history, he calls it, of the city. Well, a thick history of a place begins to tell us what the place's essence is. What is its soul? What is the soul of Chicago? What's the soul of LA? What's the soul of Santiago or anywhere else? And when he talks about, quote, thick history, he's really talking about everybody participating together in conversations with one another about the essence, that soul. That's what they agreed to try to do. And from that emerged in the 20th century what we call urban theory. That is, people began to debate, agree on the major questions that they wanted to look at. So now I want to turn to the cities that are the object, have been the object of much study. Los Angeles. Although Los Angeles gave birth to the LA school only in the 1990s, really, so it comes late. I think I'll start there because it is so contemporary and recognizable, the themes. The LA school scholars got together and was it Arrowhead? Oh gosh, I've forgotten the particular place in near Los Angeles that they gathered, and in the early 1990s, and they did a lot of drinking, frankly, and staying up late. But
it is in the war school of LA, so it was necessary.
And it gave, however, their intense conversations gave rise to an agreement among them that what characterized Los Angeles was that it was a fragmented, extremely fragmented, disaggregated urban geography that was so fragmented that it was essentially ungovernable. Mike Davis, the historian, adopted a particularly noir interpretation of that fragmentation when he referred to the carceral archipelago. That is, that his notion was that Los Angeles was fragmented into a system of protected enclaves, often walled communities that were protected from places that were marginalized and heavily policed, that is, subject to incarceration in effect. So that's the noir interpretation of the negative side of a fragmented urban geography. But and City of Quartz is a wonderful book that any urban scholar needs to read. It's one of those books that, if you enjoy fiction, that takes you along a sort of path that you can't resist until you reach the end. City of Quartz is one book in our field, the urban field, everyone should study. And City of Quartz, the title comes from the idea that LA can only be understood through every part of a prism that reflects light in every direction. So they agreed that it's a fragmented geography. So let's look at some of the particular claims they made. One is that Michael Deere said, geography has trumped government. That is, geography has made it impossible to achieve a metropolitan-wide or society-wide governmental apparatus that may mediate the differences among the different groups that compose a metropolis. Instead, each particular jurisdiction of that metropolis pursues its own interests, and that those interests tend to make them insular, separated from one another, and that the metropolis as a whole is therefore becomes ungovernable. The Los Angeles scholars agreed on that basic point, that what they came to call the postmodern metropolis was an ungovernable place. Los Angeles government has represented frailty, fraction, and division, is another quote. The LA School is known for its focus on a social construction of urban space. The idea that politics has failed, that urban space is constructed socially, not politically. And that LA, and that if we consider what overall narrative we would, how we would describe Los Angeles, it would be as Ed Soja, the geographer, came to call, and others came to call, in the label of postmodern metropolis. And they proposed something radical, that every city in the world was becoming like Los Angeles. That in the global age, the pressures of globalization, the free movement of capital around the world, was creating a context in which politics was breaking down everywhere. That local differences were disappearing between the onslaught of large-scale forces of history and of economics. Okay, so I have, that's a really brief description. There's so much more to the LA School, but you read the book, you read the essays in the book, but that's what gave the LA School its punch. That is, who would not want to argue with that? Those kind of, that. Who could resist the target the LA scholars put on their own backs? They were saying, well, dare us to be wrong. And they were even doing something more radically. They were going to say, well, all of you people who have studied anything else elsewhere are going to be thrown into the dustbin of history. Get aboard. And recognize that New York and Chicago and, well, by implication, any city in the world will soon have to be studied through our lens, that we are making any other study of the city irrelevant and antiquated. So it's a radical perspective, and that transformed and upset the urban field, and that's why I treated it first here. The Chicago School. Let me do the New York School next. The New York School. Well, is there a New York School? One of the things that that contributed to our conference back in 2001, and our conference back in, when was it, Dick, on our campus? 2008, perhaps, or 7?
Yeah, something in that
was
range.
that we invited a couple of scholars from New York who had written a book proposing that there was a New York School of Urban Studies. Now, what did they claim to have found that made New York so distinctive that you could say that there's a distinct perspective that would describe its scholarship? One of the unpersuasive aspects of their argument was that the people they considered part of the school were actually of different generations, would not have recognized that they were part of the school, any school or perspective. And I'm going to have to be right.
Take over for a second, Dennis. And we're going to take, in fact, why don't we go ahead and take our break early and give Dennis a chance to recover. So we'll come back in 15 minutes at, it would be 5:06 at that point, and begin the conversation. And Dennis will have a chance to recover from his cough. So we'll take our usual 15-minute break, and we'll be back, and we'll pick up with the New York School.